So welcome to your Wilderness Wednesday, hosted by the um, extension office in Kankakee, I believe. And Holly can put that in the chat if I mess that up. I do have two screens, so I can see the chat as we're going. So if you have any questions or want me to cover something a little bit more, please put it in the chat and I'll see that and can stop and we can discuss that. It also give you a chance to unmute at that time if you would like. So with that, we'll go ahead and start. I always think when you come to these things, it's a little nice to know who's giving the talk and where my training has come from and sort of my thinking is coming from, especially since I'm going to give some recommendations for native bees in Illinois. So currently I'm a lecturer at the University of Illinois in the School of Integrated Biology. What that means is that I currently teach a lot of our classes for our majors and our master's programs. But I do some academic advising and some research with undergraduate students at this point. I've been at the university since 2014. I did my master's, PhD, and my postdoctoral training here in Dr. Alex Harmon-Threet's lab in the Department of Entomology. And during that time, I did a lot of projects on native bees and insect ecology, but mostly native bees, things like their responses to pesticides, how changing trophic interactions, so how they interact with bees or how they interact with spiders. We'll talk a little bit about that work today. And then looking at how habitat loss and fragmentation impacts their movement and why that might be important for conservation. But then insects, it was sort of, when I was doing bees, sometimes I would extend it out to insects. So there's some stuff about pesticides and then that movement across landscapes. All right, so in constructing this talk, I kind of went two ways. We have these scientific conferences where we go and we kind of drone on for 15 minutes about a specific project. But since this is a longer form and a more information giving rather than, it's hard for you to communicate back with me on Zoom. I sat down and thought, like, what do I think you want to learn? So today we're going to cover some information about your native bees in Illinois. I think there'll be some surprises. Threats to native bees. Some of them you'll know, some of them maybe you haven't quite thought of. And then I think sort of what everyone really wants is what you can do to help native bees in your local landscapes. So if there's one thing I impress upon you in this talk, it's that native bees are diverse. You can see all these pictures here are from the USGS bee inventory. They take all these great stacked high contrast images. They're available in the public domain online. So if you just Google USGS bee inventory and monitoring lab, you can find these and many, many more. I think there are like 56 pages. I got through 10 pages in about half an hour, just kind of picking out some of my favorite species and groups. And these range from large bumblebees to really small Hylaeus, these yellow-faced bees. This is a insect pin. It's about the size of a sewing needle, and that's a little tiny bee glued to it. And these are just so cool to me. I mean, this is the close-up of its face. It's got these like cool yellow markings, little like wasp-looking fighter jet things. And so those are very different. They're not very hairy. They actually ingest the nectar that they're feeding on and the pollen and then regurgitate it for their young. So they don't have bunches of hairs like other groups do. But you can see there's so many more bees than honeybees, bumblebees, and carpenter bees, which tend to be the ones people are most familiar with. How many more bees? Well, currently we have about 2,000 described species globally. In North America, we have about 4,000, which is a pretty good number if you consider the amount of land mass compared to, Eurasia and Africa. And in Illinois, based on one of my former lab mates, We think there are about 500 current species in the state. And if you're interested in the list of all 500, it's included in this publication, Decker et al. 2020. It's in the Journal of the Kansas Entomological Society. I have my email at the end, so I can send this to you if you're interested. But that lists all the species that she was able to find in the state through a number of different mechanisms. And if another plug, if you're interested, there's this resource, The Bees in Your Backyard. It's sort of it's technical, but it's not super technical. It'll give you some identification resources for some of the most common things you're likely to see in your gardens or in your natural areas. Again, it's not the end all, but it's a really good start. It's not terribly expensive. I think it's a little more accessible for the general public. But you can see here on the right, which wasn't really well depicted in the photos I showed before, just the wide range of bees too. And I think this is something that surprises people. We have the honeybee sort of in the middle here. And a honeybee is actually a fairly large bee. Of course, carpenter bees are bigger, and you probably encountered those. But we have many, many species that are much smaller, that go unnoticed most of the time when people are looking in their gardens. So that's just kind of like to open your eyes to some of those things you might be seeing around you. And some of them look quite wasp-like too. So you have to be kind of careful. If it's not bothering you, would generally recommend leaving the wasps and bees alone. All right, and just beyond taxonomic diversity, they're also really diverse in how they've evolved and how they kind of go about their lives. And one thing that really surprises people is that most bee species are solitary. So when people think bees, they usually think honeybee hives, maybe bumblebee hives, which are in this 9% that are social. But the vast majority of species, the female, she collects all the pollen, all the nectar by herself. She rolls it into a little ball and she lays an egg on that and then closes off that nest and starts again. And she's not actively caring for that developing individual, just sort of provisioned and then left to its devices. And there are different levels to this. So there are like solitary bees, which have single nests away from other individuals of their species. And then there are communal solitary bees, where a bunch of nests will be close together, and that provides benefits against predators, and they can find each other more easily for mating. So that's evolved a few times. It is generally seen as one of the first steps to a social life style. Within social bees, we have the eusocial bees. So this is, again, what you're really thinking about when you think of bees. Honeybee hives, this advanced eusocial society with the overlapping generations, taking care of all the developing offspring together. Below that, we have cooperative breeding. So this is seen as sort of a step between solitary and social, where there might be multiple individuals in a nest, and maybe one of them is the primary egg layer. So she's kind of like a mini queen, but all of the other individuals have bred likely and could lay eggs too, which is a little bit different than honeybees, where the workers aren't, they can lay drones, but they are usually not mated. And then we have parasitic bees. And so this is a group that, again, I think really surprises people. There are two types. There are brood parasites. So these species will crawl into a nest, usually a solitary bee nest, and they'll eat the egg or the early larva of another bee and then lay their egg on the pollen ball that's in there. And so by this way, they don't have to put in the work to collect the resources themselves. They just have to have the other task of trying to find these unguarded nests. So trading things off. And then social parasites, we see this a lot in bumblebees. It's really just they're species that live within the hives of other species, and they consume the resources, but they're not going out of their way to kill the other individual. So they're just kind of leeching off of the hive. And then an added layer of complexity is we have many species who are socially polymorphic. So they can be solitary under certain conditions, but if those conditions change, then maybe they're doing this cooperative breeding where there are multiple females in one nest. And that can vary based on predation risks, these parasitism risks, how much the resource quality in the environment. So that's like another interesting fold. And there's a lot of research currently going into the evolution of sociality and why it's evolved so many times and in places where it's been lost. And another way that bees are diverse is in their diets. So this will come back when we talk about recommendations for plants that you should install in your gardens and native and natural areas. But bees range all the way from they just consume resources from a single species to they can use anything. And there are lots of terms along this range that you might see. Predominantly monolecty, oligolecty, and polylecty are sort of the original terms. And we've recognized that there's a gradient, and so we have sort of terms that go in between them. Another thing that really seems to surprise people is the diverse homes of our native bees, and this idea or this observation that most species nest in the ground. So when you think of like ant nests, we're talking about something similar, but on a much smaller scale, right? Solitary species, usually with the one female who's acting sort of the queen and worker at the same time. So some species dig their own holes. Others use holes that are dug by different organisms. So rodent holes are often used. We'll see sometimes that beetle holes can be used in certain circumstances. But they're just sort of finding cavities to modify for themselves. And then sort of what do the other 15% of species do? They nest above ground in different substrates. So some use existing cavities. So this would be where our honeybees fall, right? They're in their native range in Europe and Africa. They nest in like tree hollows and other kind of cavity areas above ground. We also have like dead wood, pithy stems, which we'll talk about more. And we have some really like oddballs to me. So there are some species that nest in snail shells. This has been really well described in Europe. There are a number of species. This is Osmia bicoloris, biclora. It nests in snail shells, so it'll collect some pollen, put it toward the back, lay an egg on that, and then seal it. I think it can do a couple within the shell. And then there are certain other observations like the ground prong on outdoor outlets can sometimes be used as nesting cavities by really small bees. So sometimes that's sort of plastered over with a little mud. It could be a bee or some wasp has laid an egg within your outlet. So if you've ever had that happen. Bees also have diverse life cycles. Again, I think everyone kind of comes from the view of honeybees, but honeybees are really an outlier and kind of different than a lot of other species. So most species, at least in temperate regions, have one generation per year. And when that generation starts can vary. So bees that emerge in the spring, as adults, they lay their egg. They collect resources from, you might see them collecting from trees or early spring flowers. They'll lay their larva. The larva will develop during the summer. Early fall, they'll pupate and then become adults, and they'll spend the winter as the next generation of adults, right? So it takes one full year for the offspring to come out. Other species, you can get much shorter turnaround. So you might have a couple of generations during the year. Sometimes it'll be sort of like 1.5, where um, parents that emerge early in the season might have enough time to give their offspring a chance to develop, grow, and have their own offspring. So 2 generations in a year, um, where some of the offspring will actually just overwinter instead of completing that life cycle. So again, just a lot of diversity and a lot of um, different ways to be successful. And kind of along with that is this diverse adult activity periods, or you might hear it referred to as phenology. Um, so I like to remind a lot of people or let them know that for the most part, the majority of a bee's life is spent in the nest. Um, for some species, that's as a larva. For others, it's as a dormant adult before they come out. Um, And so in this table, this figure on the right here, we have, I think it's 23 species from one genus, so Andrena. Um, and even though they're all closely related in the sense that they're in the same genus, the adults emerge across the summer. Some are in April, May, and some don't come out until August, September. And that influences, what species are of flower are available to them. It influences what species they might be competing for resources against. Um, so as like these 5 species down here, even if they're in the same exact area, they're not really competing with these species that emerge earlier in the year, um, because the adults aren't active in collecting those resources at the same time. Similarly, the species of flowers can be very different. I'm sure many of you are aware, if you walk out to your local prairie today, can compare it to what you saw in June or May. Very few, if any, of the flowering species will be the same. Uh, I think in native prairies, I can't really think of many species that would still be in bloom that were in bloom in May or June. There might be a couple, but it gives you sort of an idea of like this turnover in those communities. And then there we have some species who will have adults kind of active throughout the year. So a really common one you might see are these Ogochlorella bees. And um, they have multiple generations per year. From this phenology map, you can kind of see these different spikes, and that's sort of when the new batch of adults emerges and starts collecting pollen and nectar. Um, so some species, do spread across the year, and we need to provide resources to support all 3 of these bumps in activity. And what they eat during those 3 times might be, might be very different. Sorry about that. Hit my back button. All right. So that's sort of the first part. Hopefully, you kind of come to appreciate, how bees are so different, and maybe start thinking about how that influences the challenges they are going to face that we'll discuss, but also how we might help our native species, right? If they're so different, what does that mean for us? So you may have seen a figure similar to this somewhere. Um,
I don't know if you can hear me, Nick, but you're muted at this time.
Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. Um, was it muted for a long time? 6:85, just a little bit. Um,
It pretty much when you went to the second uh, section there, when you started that, after
okay.
you told us, that's where you kind of went out.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I may have missed then that the population is being disconnected. I told a little bit of there was this research with bumblebees where they looked at bumblebee movement across railroad tracks, and it was in like a rural area, so it's not like a railroad yard or anything. It's just a set of railroad tracks, um, and that was a pretty effective barrier to bumblebee movement. Like these really large bumblebees, which should be able to travel and physically were able to travel over the railroad tracks, didn't make those movements on their own. The researchers actually had to like put them on the other side to prove that they could get back to their colonies. And so when we lose habitat, we sort of have these unintended consequences that affect movement and can disconnect populations in terms of breeding. And then it also increases more inhospitable habitat, right? So if you think about road edges, you see that there tend to be more impacted by invasive species. That happens too in smaller natural areas, right? It's easier for things to invade. Um, and by losing habitat, we also have inhospitable areas, so impervious surfaces like roads and parking lots. Not a whole lot that a bee can get in terms of its food resources or nesting resources in those habitats. Then we have invasive species. And this is where I'm going to really put on my like honeybees are bad. So competitors, right? So honeybees are introduced from Europe and later Africa to the Americas. And they're really good competitors. They eat everything. The hives are huge. And that really has an impact on native species being able to collect the resources that they need to grow their populations. Invasive species can also become predators, so not so much invasive bees, but invasive arthropods that maybe are really good at eating bees, and that can alter the community dynamics in unintended ways. And then they can also introduce pathogens. So when a new species comes, it brings along with it its diseases, and we see that with bumblebees, and we'll mention that a little bit later. A lot of these things sort of compound into genetic diversity by having less habitat and just shrinking populations. It just kind of goes hand in hand with reduced genetic diversity. And that means that these native species might be less resilient to future changes and more sensitive to going locally or globally extinct. Part of this is through the accumulation of mutations. And by not being able to have that gene flow, we can't really flush them out of the population. Climate change, really here, the big thing is mismatch activity with the adults and their preferred flowers. So things like specialists in particular might be at danger of those phenology mismatches. One that a lot of people really focus on, and we'll talk about, are pesticides. So there are lethal effects. So pesticides can kill bees very quickly, but it's not always just fast deaths. So there are sublethal effects. So these would be things like reduced brain development, reduced motor activity, so maybe not moving or foraging as far, things that are going to impact their ability to create offspring that are in a good number, right? So you need a lot of offspring. A lot of them are going to get eaten by predators, so we need to sort of flood our habitats, and then they need to be well provisioned, right? If the moms are just building a pollen ball, it needs to be big enough to create a healthy and strong offspring. And pathogens and parasites are kind of the same. Some of them cause direct mortality, so they kill individuals. that's pretty easy to see why it's bad. But there can also be sublethal effects, so they can sort of impact the same things, maybe reduce how much the female moves or how quickly she can dig new nest cells. And that can impact the whole population, and that kind of compounds year after year. So that's sort of, there's a lot of doom and gloom about bees. There are a lot of studies tracking which species are declining versus increasing. And there are some of both. So there are like winners and losers. And I think at the end of the day, we're not really talking about the extinction of bees as a group, but we are talking about the extinction of a large subset of species. And that could have huge ecological impacts and have all these devastating effects for plant communities, insect communities that rely on those plants, for humans, for all sorts of wildlife. So we'll probably die. Humans will be are more likely to go extinct as a species than the last species of bee, mostly because if it's gotten that bad, it's hard to imagine that humans are still making it work. And so I hope that there's some optimism in there that, we can do something to help bees. And I have some research-based recommendations that you can implement either in your gardens or the natural areas that you work with. And these recommendations, I want them to inform your choices, but I don't, this idea that perfect is the enemy of good, right? If you really try to get everything dialed in, like the right exact species, that's going to take away from, the immediacy of we need things now, and trying to implement some of these general things is going to be beneficial both in the short term and the long term. And you're going to learn in your garden or your natural area what works best there, what things are visited by insects, by bees in particular. And you're going to build that local knowledge either yourself or with other people who are around you in your community. So I think starting is really the most important thing, and sort of worrying about perfect or improvement as you go. So my number one thing, and I hope I can just stop one person from keeping honeybees to save bees, then this talk will be a success. If your goal is to help native bees, don't keep honey or bumblebees for that reason. There are agricultural reasons to have honeybees. If you are a honeybee keeper and that's how you make your living, then that's great. Like, all the more power to that industry. But as a native bee biologist, I think of honeybees more like cattle. They're an agricultural animal. They're facing certain challenges, but again, as a native bee, North American native bee ecologist, I'm not worried about honeybees. We'll just keep buying them from Europe and replenishing. And so hopefully you won't be worried about them either if you're just worried about native bees. I did want to make a little bit of a caveat. So at the university, we have a honeybee scientist, Dr. Adam Dolezal, and he's really in tune with the agriculture in the state and with it in Iowa, where he does postdoc. And sometimes honeybees might just be a necessary evil. So I wasn't aware until I talked to him that there are a lot of rules about taking land out of agricultural production. The USDA apparently really dislikes that. So one thing that they've been sort of suggesting to get around that, if people want to plant these more natural habitats, is to create honeybee habitat. And the idea here is that the land is still in agricultural production. It's just now in honey production rather than corn and soy. That's mainly what they're trying to get things out of. And so in those cases, keeping honeybees or bumblebees for the purpose of helping native bees is better than nothing, right? So this is that idea of perfect is the enemy of good. Sometimes we have to accept honeybees, but if you have a tract of land that's already set up and you're just looking to see what species you should seed or what other things you can do, honeybees is very low on the list. Bumblebees would also would be low on the list. There's been a good amount of research from Dr. Sidney Cameron, who recently retired from the U of I, but is still doing a bit of work on this, that these managed bumblebees that you can order in boxes like those shown on the right here can spread pathogens across the United States, and that might be one of the major drivers of bumblebee declines in North America. So this picture here is actually a good use of bumblebees. It's in these greenhouses, or this isn't a hoop house, but sometimes they'll be in hoop houses, where this is all netted in. These are probably tomato plants. That's what they're mostly used for. And so in that case, they're not really interacting with our native species, and that works out just fine. And the final thing is that a lot of beekeepers use pesticides to control for things like varroa mites, which are really important drivers of honeybee health and negative impact on honeybee health. And sometimes those miticides can get into the environment where maybe, honeybees being so large, they might not have an impact on them, but smaller bees, that dosage might be enough to cause some issues. So that's sort of another way that they're not very helpful. All right. And so for this next section, we're going to talk about some of the do's, right? And if you need help sort of remembering this later, coming back to this idea that diversity begets diversity. And that's going to be your aim in your gardens and your native plant areas or natural areas. So do plant diverse native flowering plants. So look for things that are different colors, shapes. You want a good number of individuals of the same species. So it's not just, one of each, Noah's Arking it, maybe two of each for the analogy to fit. But focus on a wide range of species, and maybe don't try to do everything, but have good patches, have a couple of patches. Bees tend to have this behavior where they visit the same species over and over again in a foraging flight. And so if you have a lot of that species, that gives them a lot of opportunity to collect resources efficiently. At a more broader time scale, look for species that have overlapping flowering times. So if you're familiar with the USDA Conservation Reserve Program, it's this program originally intended to reduce soil erosion, where they take land out of crop production and plant it in a semi-native state. And there's a pollinator-focused one called CP42. And one of the requirements is that the flowering periods overlap. You have a certain number of species. And so try to mimic that. That was suggested for a reason. And I brought back this picture of the Andrena and their emergence times. And you see, what you need is flowers that sort of match these times, right? Something that's there in April and May, throughout the summer, some things sort of patching in all the way through September. One of the questions I often get at talks like this is, what plants? Just tell me what I need to go to buy. I'll buy it. I'll put it in. And just, that's what you want to do. And unfortunately, it's not that easy. Your areas, even within the state, are going to differ depending on if you have an urban garden or a garden in a more rural area, or a large tract of land, right? So what I would suggest is, getting out in nature. I think everyone in this group enjoys doing that. And start looking and seeing what bees in your area are visiting, right? So see what some of your native bumblebees are going to. If you buy that book, which I don't get any money for, so the bees of your backyard, you get an idea of what other bees look like. And you can start to see which things are really well visited. So from my personal experience, a lot of sort of purpley flowers like purple prairie clover are really well visited, ironweed. But that's just here around Urbana-Champaign. I'm not sure how well that translates other places. So just kind of get out and see what things are being visited. And then I'd also caution you about purchasing plants from areas that guarantee their survival. Home Depot was doing this for a while, where if you bought a plant, they like guaranteed that it would last the whole year. And they often achieve this by treating the plants with pesticides to keep them from being consumed by herbivores. So you want to avoid that. So you really should be visiting more local nurseries, places or greenhouses where maybe you can talk to someone who's actually helping take care of the plants and get an idea of what goes into it. Whereas Home Depot, they are trucked in. Usually the employees, they don't really have that information. And you can always grow from seed too. So if you have the facilities or the idea to do that, or spreading seed, those ways often work as well. All right, so we've got diversity of our food resources. We also need a diversity of places for the bees to have their nests, right? So where are they going to put their babies? This picture from the USDA is actually really neat. Kind of shows different areas where you might have access to soil for surface nesting. Some bees like to nest in riverbanks. I realize that not everyone's house has a riverbank, especially in Illinois. So, but just kind of gives you an idea of, it's not a single landscape. There's a lot going on here. Snag trees can be really helpful. Again, safety is important. Rodent burrows aren't shown in here, but some bumblebees and some other bees like to use empty rodent burrows. You can plant species with pithy or hollow stems. So pithy stems, if you don't know, you break a stem open and it's got that sort of soft, spongy layer in the middle. Bees really like to sort of dig that out and lay their eggs and make their nests inside of that. And then you can also leave areas of bare ground. I think there's sort of currently this idea that everything needs to be mulched. It looks very attractive to some people, but it's really hard on ground nesting bees. They don't really like to dig through wood mulches to get to the soil surface. So you want to leave some bare areas. And areas with a bit of slope can be good as well. So sort of mimicking the riverbanks. That helps with like drainage, and that seems to be something that they enjoy. All right, so another sort of don't or caution. These are another popular thing right now. These nest blocks or bee hotels, they were even in that USDA image here in the middle. They provide a lot of nesting resources to bees, but they can also provide a lot of bee resources to pathogens and predators. So they don't require a ton of maintenance, but the maintenance is very important if you're going to install something like this. You can't just leave it forever because it's going to build up different molds, different diseases. Different predators will move in and set up shop. And And so you really need to be able to commit to a yearly maintenance schedule. And this website, crownbees.com, they sell a lot of these types of materials, but they're also very aware that these problems exist. And so they have a lot of resources on how to maintain them, how to extract all of the cocoons of your bees every year so you can sort of sort out the parasites and keep all of your healthy bees separate and then release them again the next year. So they do take some work. If you're interested in it, I would start with a smaller style bee block, see what the maintenance is like 1 year before investing in something large like they're right here. And if you already have something like this, makes great projects for kids. Like, it's very easy to train on sort of the sanitation of these bee hotels. All right, and so we got the resources, we have the food and the nesting resources. Another thing I want to really kind of impart on you is to support the whole community of creatures. Can help with competition and changing behavior. So we did this research in Missouri, looking at these really bright eastern collared lizards. And there's this big conservation effort in the Ozark Mountains, and they really impact bee or spider communities. And that has a effect then on bee communities. So in areas that were restored, so had the lizard and had healthier spider communities, we saw bee species respond more positively to flower resources. So increasing how many flowers were there and the species richness, we got more species of bees faster than sort of these degraded predator communities. That happened without increasing abundance. So most of this increased abundance in the degraded habitat were a few really common, not conservationally important species that kind of survive no matter what. And we think that part of this increase here is changes in competitive dynamics. So again, in degraded areas, bees kind of visited flowers at the same rate all day. But when the predator communities were restored, there was a push to foraging more in the morning, suggesting that there's more competition for resources. And so these bees had to get out earlier before everything was depleted. So that's a more natural state, and that's what we see in more pristine environments. So in this circumstance, really focusing on the whole community of creatures benefited the bee communities. And in your sort of neck of the woods, things like grasshopper sparrows that consume spiders, so providing bird habitat can be really important to regulating predator populations. So something to always to consider. Always love pheasants forever. People, because they tend to really want whole community conservation. And then the last thing is like how much space. So can you only do a single large, or if you have several small habitats? So bees are central place foragers. Remember, they have that nest and they're going and collecting, and then they're returning to that spot. And that's pretty much their life. They go out, they collect, they come back. And so when the habitat is split up into these several small areas, that means they might have to travel further. So ideally, we'd have large, continuous habitats for our bees. But again, don't let that stop you from having smaller areas, because even those are providing something. Larger bees can move further, so they're less impacted, and they can really take advantage of these pollinator hotspots. Bees are unlikely to move. Well, actually, if we flip through this, bees are unlikely to move from high resource areas. So we did this work in a naturally broken up landscape. And really what I want you to take away from here is that this green dotted line, those were from areas that were really high quality. And the bees tended not to move from them. Whereas if there was really low quality, then the bees would move to high quality patches away. So for you, like really your efforts to improve that habitat are going to be rewarded. The bees are really going to appreciate that and respond in kind. And they can also utilize some of that area around the main habitat. So these smaller pollinator hotspots, like they can help in landscapes that are resource poor. So they're a good secondary thing if you can't have a big habitat. And then in terms of pesticides, because this usually comes up, we really need a return to integrated pest management. So using economics to decide when to or if to manage for a pest species. This greatly reduces chemical pesticides. The reason why we've gone away from it, particularly with neonicotinoids, which are kind of a buzzword right now, is that neonicotinoids are really cheap and easy to apply. So we have some soybean pictured here, and this blue powder is the pesticide. It's on the seeds. It's really cheap, and then it's always there, ready for to protect against pests. The problem is that it gets into your natural areas and it can be consumed by bees and contact the developing larvae, and so that's where all the negatives come in. So really the problem for me for neonics is not so much that they're toxic to bees. Lots of pesticides are. It's how we use them. If we only use them when we need them, then that's going to really reduce the impact on bees. But the fact that we're using them all the time is really, in my opinion, the major problem. All right, so these positive effects can really compound, right? So reducing pesticide use is going to have a positive impact on predators, because predators are really negatively impacted by neonicotinoids in semi-natural areas. And these diverse flower plantings are, we're targeting bees, but they also benefit many other species, including those natural enemies that we're trying to restore. So really, these things are kind of happening together, and you don't have to necessarily focus on each of them one at a time. They're going to build. I think that's really encouraging. All right, so a quick recap of what you can do. Don't keep honeybees. Do plant diverse native flowers and native or nesting resources. Try to support the whole community of organisms. Larger spaces are better, but smaller spaces can be fine as well if that's what you have. And try to limit pesticide usage, either yourself, including herbicides, to only what is necessary. I understand that some invasive species, you really have to be aggressive. In those cases, it makes sense. All right, so with that, I think I ran a bit over, but thank you for listening. We can do a little bit of Q&A, but I have my email address and my office phone number and website if you want to get into touch with me in the future. If you have any questions, happy to field them later too. All right, so I'll give everyone a second to kind of look at that and then take it away. All right, so either in the chat or if you want to unmute yourself, if you have any questions, I'm happy to, or discussion about what you're doing or what you're seeing in your areas.
Thank you, Nick. This has been very interesting. I've been trying to log in through Zoom, so finally I just came in through my phone, but I really appreciate that you've taken the time tonight to talk about native bees, and I've learned a lot about them from you tonight that I never thought about before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's just part of the awareness, right? Like, and what's funny is usually I start talking to people, they'll start realizing like, oh, I do know more species of bees, right? They usually say, I only thought about honeybees, and you can sort of prod them with bumblebees, carpenter bees. A lot of people grew up with sweat bees, the little bees that lick your sweat. Interestingly, those are the ones that get stung by the most. It's not so much the big bees. All right, so in the chat, Dale asked, would a couple of 6x6 areas be too small to be impactful, or will it help? Yeah, so 6x6 is larger than some of these small pollinator hotspots we have in Urbana-Champaign. Depending on how far they are, they might even act as sort of one big unit. Many species of bees can travel, a couple 100 yards. So if they're kind of within that same area, they might be visiting all of them. And in many cases, that's better than what's there. So I would say a couple of 6x6 areas can be impactful. Certain species are going to do better than others, but it's better than the alternative, which in most cases is nothing. Okay, yeah. So Becky asked in the chat why bumblebees are not desired. Native bumblebees are desirable. I should clarify that. But keeping or ordering bumblebees is not desirable. So yay, native species that are just naturally existing. Most people aren't aware that you can order bumblebees through the mail. Those bumblebees are the issue because they can sometimes bring pathogens along with them, which is the main problem. So they come, they interact with flowers, the pathogen gets on the flowers, and then you have native bees who interact with those flowers and maybe take the pathogen back. So the bumblebees, yeah, you see around, like, those are good. Yeah, don't order the boxed bumblebees if you can help it. Yeah, thanks, Becky. That was a good clarification.
I can't see if there's any others in the chat, but I really appreciate you getting on tonight, Nick, and talking to us about native bees. And I think I'll spend a little more time thinking about them than I have in the past. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, oh gosh, what the honeybees versus that people are purchasing and bringing in versus native bees. I'll have a whole new appreciation after tonight.
Yeah, and that's awesome to hear. That's really why I like to do these talks.
So if anybody thinks of something later tonight or when they're brushing their teeth, they think, oh, I should have asked Nick. I have his contact information. You guys have my contact information when you registered, and I have Nick. So if you think of something and you can't remember how to get a hold of him, you can get a hold of me, and I can get a hold of him. If you think, oh gosh, I just thought about this native bee that I've been wondering about, we can take it another step.
Yeah, for sure.
So if you have questions about native bees or things for habitat for native bees, which now you've got my thinking on that, we can talk and ask Nick questions going forward. So Nick, thank you for kicking off, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get on. I had put together a little speech about a little biography about you and about your background. I'm sorry that for whatever reason I wasn't able to. I practiced ahead of time with my new iPad and everything. I thought I had it all charged. I thought I was ready to roll, and I ended up on my phone, old school. But thank you so much for getting on, and you kicked off our Wilderness Wednesdays. You were a kickoff tonight.
Awesome.
And we have we have some really good presentations coming up. You might want to join us. And they're next week. They're every Wednesday night in September. We do September and January, and they have something to do with natural resources all on Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. So thank you for kicking us off and getting us ready and started. And this was a good way to go into the fall.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'll have to check those out. Everyone else should too. Yeah, cool.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Holly. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.